It's a pleasure and honor to be here. I've had a great time so far. Your weather is fantastic, and I want to thank Canon and the BIR for this opportunity. I did tweak the title slide just a little bit, just to make sure we're all clear that I'm not going to be speaking globally on a talk you could have heard elsewhere, but this is really specific to and is a byproduct of the work I've done, that we've done at Wisconsin with CTC screening over the past 15 years or so, and has led to these insights by being able to follow polyps in vivo and really get into the natural history in a way that we've never been able to any other way. So I hope that makes sense. By the time we're done, I'll have shown a lot of cases, quite a bit of material to get through. These are my disclosures. And then, of course, this is in honor of Professor Val Mayneord, who was a pioneer in health physics research and health physics in medicine. So as just a brief outline, I'm going to cover kind of the basics, colorectal cancer, why should we care, and then talk a little bit about the classic sort of linear adenoma carcinoma sequence that we're all familiar with, and then spend a little bit of time, I'm sure many of you are familiar with CTC, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page with that and my experience with that, and then get into these sort of predictors of importance with these polyps, that is static things that we've known about for a long time, and I guess my mouse pointer isn't showing up there, is it? That's going to be an issue. And then dynamic. I'll focus more on dynamic issues because those are what CTC adds to all of this in a novel way. Finish up with interval cancers, and then if there's time, I'll touch on the future of some of the other things we're working on that may shed more light into this natural history process. So just a few basics. In the developed world, colorectal cancer is the second leading cause of death from cancers worldwide, and that's partly because, or mainly because, it affects both men and women. So it's not, it adds up between the two to be the second leading cause of cancer death. And the real shame of that is this is a preventable disease. If you look at the major cancers on the right-hand side, lung cancer, prostate, pancreas, all the others, there's really no precursor lesion with which we can prevent cancer. So this is quite different, and we know the vast majority develop very slowly, if not all, from a benign precursor. We thought most of them came from the adenoma carcinoma sequence, and they probably still do, probably anywhere from 75 to maybe 85%. And we know this from work done largely in the UK, Professor Morrison at St. Mark's, of course. Subsequent work by people like Vogelstein have led to these so-called Vogelgrams, where you get these multiple hits happening in sequence. However, this theory or this model has been come into question, and I'll talk about that a little bit as we go forward, that there may be, it may be a little more complicated than that. Further complicating things too is this serrated polyp pathway, which may account for anywhere from 15 to 30% of cancers, and we'll have some time to talk about that. But the bottom line is the rationale for screening is these are benign lesions that we can halt the process before it even becomes cancer. So cancer detection, of course, is important, but cancer prevention, in my opinion, has much more benefit from a population standpoint. The problem is, in the US at least, most people are either not screened or are underscreened, and I would consider underscreened being any stool-based test that doesn't identify large precursor lesions with a high enough sensitivity. So put simply another way, you know, if we just assume there is this linear sort of progression, very few of these tiny polyps become cancer, and it's important to look at the prevalence of these things. So I've added tiny subcentimeter polyps on the left-hand side here, and if you look at screening prevalence, so these are healthy 50-year-old adults, let's say, we're finding at colonoscopy trials that half or more of the population has at least one tiny polyp. Some of the motivation may be that we can charge more every time we find a tiny polyp and resect it. So we're getting better and better at endoscopy at finding those lesions and removing them in a universal way at colonoscopy. However, when you get to more clinically relevant lesions, the large adenomas, the advanced adenomas, we'll talk more about definitions in a second. Now we're talking about 5%, or 1 in 20 will have one of these important precursor lesions that have probably already decided that a number of these are going to continue to grow, and we have evidence to support that. In an asymptomatic population, every time we look, it's about 0.2%, or 1 in 500 will have a colon cancer that's unsuspected. So that's a pretty rare event. It's still worth finding. But in a symptomatic population, of course, that number would increase. But if you're just looking at asymptomatic screening, it's important to realize that the benefit comes more from those large adenomas than the rare unsuspected cancers. So in my opinion, I think in the US we go a little too far with colonoscopy because it's overkill. It's leading to increased costs and complications to identify all these tiny lesions, the vast majority of which will never become cancer. And at the other end of the spectrum, the stool-based tests, which they do detect the majority of early cancers as well, but do a fairly poor job of preventing cancer. And the numbers, as you know from FIT and stool DNA, will vary anywhere from maybe 10% to 40% detection, as opposed to colonoscopy and CTC, which will detect pretty easily 95% or more of these large lesions. So I hope that makes sense. And so the only test as it stands that really focuses on what I would call this Goldilocks zone is CTC. And it really it ignores small lesions on purpose. We can identify them, but we don't send patients on for tiny lesions. And of course, it can find the large adenomas and cancers and really focuses on that part of the spectrum. So getting back to colon cancer, again, we have these two pathways now. On the left, we have the conventional pathway that we're all familiar with, and I won't go into detail on that. We'll talk a little more about that later. On the right-hand side, we have this alternative serrated pathway that's important to know about. These tend to be flat, right-sided precursor lesions, these sessile serrated polyps or adenomas or lesions. The terminology is sort of in flux right now. These are different. These do have a mutation associated with them, the BRAF, but they also have these epigenetic methylation events that lead to mismatch repair errors, and then ultimately in a cancer that's got microsatellite instability, which is different than the chromosomal instability of the classic cancer, if you will. So very important to know about these. Very little known about the natural history, and I think we're going to take a glimpse into that now with CTC by the time I'm done with this talk. First, some basic definitions. I think just to be on the same page, let's be clear. Diminutive lesions are 5 millimeters and less. Small are 6 to 9. They were previously called medium, but I think small is the preferred term. And then large is 10 millimeters or 1 centimeter and greater. Of course, these can be sessile, flat, or pedunculated. And then once we get to 3 centimeters, we basically call a colorectal lesion a mass, which can be polypoid. The typical invasive cancer, of course, will be annular or semi-annular or some variant thereof. And then flat lesions that are that large tend to be carpet lesions, and they are also referred to as laterally spreading tumors, and we'll talk a little bit more about those later. So in a nutshell, again, these tiny polyps or polyps in general are not the enemy because the prevalence is so high. It's essentially a normal finding, and even up to 2/3 of these tiny polyps will be tubular adenomas, so they are neoplasms, but I would argue that they're clearly not the target of screening. And so what constitutes, what is the enemy? Where should we focus our attention? Well, again, any neoplasm that's too broad. Non-diminutive adenomas, probably not. That's the current standard is 6 millimeters and greater. We tend to send everything or give patients the option of polypectomy. At colonoscopy, they're going to remove all of those lesions. In my opinion, I think it's more advanced neoplasia, that is combining the large advanced adenomas with adenocarcinoma, and this is really where prevention and detection come together in both a clinically efficacious and cost-effective way. And that's what we're doing, I think, with CTC. So just to be clear on the definition of it, the advanced adenoma, these are generally large in size, but they can also qualify by having advanced histology, that is a villus or tubulovillus or high-grade dysplasia component. In terms of serrated lesions, they tend to have to be large. Dysplasia in sub-centimeter lesions is extremely rare. But in general, these are the main target for our screening program. We're trying to find these lesions that have a very high chance of progressing on to cancer and trying to ignore all the smaller ones. And again, realize the stool-based test will miss the majority of these advanced adenomas, sometimes a large majority. The good news is, in our experience, up to 95% or more will qualify by size alone. So that's important because CTC is largely a size-based approach, although we do have other information, of course. But in this sense, we can actually use size as a surrogate definition, and we see very few sub-centimeter advanced lesions. The vast majority of those will be tubulovillous, as I'll show you in a moment. So I think, let's switch gears. I think we all know what CTC or virtual colonoscopy is. I'll use those terms interchangeably. It's really nothing more than a CT scan. The patient has had some form of bowel preparation and and colonic distension. We typically use a very low volume prep compared to our GI colleagues. It's about a half a liter in total. Magnesium citrate is what we use with oral contrast tagging, both dilute barium and iodine, non-ionic iodine contrast. And then in addition, we use CO2 for distension, and then it's simply a CT scan after that. And of course, then we're using 2D and 3D approaches to identify focal lesions. Now, this fly-through dates back to our early DOD trial. That's probably from 2001. And this was one of the lesions. As we flip around here, you see a small 6 millimeter lesion that was a tubular adenoma behind a fold in the right colon. One of the lesions missed at colonoscopy prior to unblinding of our results. And we've come to learn what lesions are typically missed at colonoscopy because of that trial and others since. So we've been doing this for about 15 years now, as I mentioned, doing same-day polypectomy in the vast majority of our screening cases, over 90%. And these are just examples we've seen over the last decade or so. Obviously, it's very gratifying to have this one-to-one correlation. As I'll mention later, our positive predictive value is over 90% down to 6 millimeters. So when we call something, send it to colonoscopy, the vast majority of the time they will find a corresponding lesion, and that's gratifying. So I'm going to break up a very brief lit review into two of our publications. One was the validation study, the other was clinical implementation, and this is again for screening. So this is the DoD trial that was referred to earlier in the introduction. And in a nutshell, this basically was a multi-center Army-Navy trial. Over 1,200 patients had same-day CTC followed by colonoscopy. We then did unblinding of our results. So we were able to actually test the reference standard, optical colonoscopy. And we were able to show that for the important lesions especially, that is advanced adenomas or large adenomas, those are almost identical, as I mentioned, and cancers, as you can see, that CTC actually did slightly better than the reference standard. That is, we missed fewer lesions prospectively than they did, and then as we uncovered our results, they were able to find some of those things they missed on the front end, usually behind a fold, sometimes in the low rectum, sort of the areas that are relative blind spots for them. And then moving on to the implementation study, this was when I was at Wisconsin. Now we're screening with CTC. And we looked at the first several thousand patients screened by CTC, compared it with a parallel cohort screened by optical colonoscopy. As you can see, the mean age and the gender mix was fairly equal, slightly younger and more female on CTC, so you'd expect fewer polyps a little bit. We send about 8% of our patients to colonoscopy, again, mostly same day. 5% are for large lesions. The other 3% are for the small 6 to 9s where patients opt for same day. And then we follow the rest of those small lesions that we find. Well, just the bottom line for this trial was our focus was really on advanced neoplasms, and we were able to detect and then subsequently remove the same number, even though only 8% had the invasive study on the on the CTC arm. We actually found more cancers in the CTC study as well. And I'm sorry you can't see my pointer. I may need a laser pointer if someone's back there. In any case, I'll try to describe things as I go. We also were able to do this in a more efficient way by removing fewer polyps, that is, ignoring the vast majority of diminutive lesions. So it was actually a more cost-effective approach to get to those few polyps that matter. We obviously find cancer outside of the colon. That is one of the opportunistic uses. We also screen for osteoporosis and AAA and other things. That's what I meant by the term opportunistic screening. And then thank you. just to make sure we have, I don't even know, yeah, hopefully you can see that. I may need that later. And they actually had 7 perforations in these 3,000 patients. That's about 2 per 1,000. That's in the range that's reported in the literature. I think we were all surprised by that. Most of those were not tied to the medical record closely. You know, you read the colonoscopy report and they said no complications. But some of these patients come back, you know, even a day or even a week later with complications, which we now know about 2%, up to 2% of Medicare patients will be hospitalized after a colonoscopy if you follow them up long enough, at least a week. So it's not a benign screening procedure, obviously. We obviously don't want to miss cancer either, so I've been harping on polyps and large precursor lesions, but that 1 in 500 cancer at screening we don't want to miss, and of course when you're screening symptomatic patients, the cancer rate will be higher. The good news is, going all the way back to the last century, basically, CTC has always been good for cancer detection. You can see it basically equivalent to optical colonoscopy. And these are complementary tests. The colonoscopy tends to miss lesions on the right side. Most of our misses are actually left-sided, so they are complementary in that sense. We also have looked quite a bit at serrated polyps and have gotten better over the years. Once we identified that the barium, we believe it's the barium, tags these flat lesions actually quite nicely. And you can see here on the center, that's a tagged lesion that's actually thickening up that 3D view. It's actually a fairly flat lesion, but with that coating of contrast, it makes it look quite obvious. And there's often a mucus cap, which I'll show in a moment here, that corresponds to that oral contrast coating. So here's an example from a recent review we did. And you can see that lesion in the ascending colon is coated with contrast on both views. It kind of thickens up it looks almost polypoid on 3D, but that's a very flat lesion that simply has that contrast tagging. And here's the mucus cap, in this case a colonoscopy. That's what the barium impregnates. We're not sure how well iodine actually coats these lesions, but we think it's primarily the barium. And that's really our beacon for detection. If it weren't for that, we would miss a lot of these subtle lesions, quite frankly. But that's, and here's an example of a serrated lesion without oral contrast tagging, and you really have to see on 3D. On 2D, it's going to be a very difficult detection, and I think most of these will be missed. And that's probably why this Dutch trial didn't fare so well with serrated lesions. They didn't use oral contrast tagging. We've known for a long time that this contrast coat is very useful for flat lesions, even before we knew serrated was an important category, but we've known about this for quite some time. All right, so now let's move on to static predictors of risk for these polyps. And I'm going to really focus on size. That's what really the vast majority of the data are really centered on that. And realize most of the colonoscopy data is post-polypectomy risk, right? We're not talking about following lesions in vivo. We're talking about resecting or harvesting lesions and then trying to figure out what the risk post-polypectomy is. So quite a different situation, and it really is fairly indirect data. But of course, size, morphology, location, and multiplicity do come into play in terms of future risk, but it obviously doesn't have to do with that lesion itself because it's been removed. So size really does matter. It's very important. It's clearly the main driver from these static measurements. At CTC, we have to be careful, of course, if this is the axial view or transverse view here, we would obviously undermeasure this lesion, maybe even call it sub-centimeter in this case. But we know that we try to optimize our 2D planes, but unfortunately the coronal and sagittal views don't cut through the long axis of this polyp, which of course we would, as you probably all know, we would measure on 3D and can do that quite accurately. So we do a combined 2D, 3D measurement to get closer to the truth. But realize what we're up against is colonoscopy measurement is really fraught with uncertainty. In all of our trials, we use this sort of this calibrated probe here. But realize that there's issues related to parallax, and most endoscopists are reluctant to use this sort of thing. They just sort of eyeball it and say, it's 2 centimeters, it's 3 centimeters. So all the data based on colonoscopy is actually not that robust in terms of polyp size measurement. And even though we force them to do this. And here you can see the parallax issue with these small lesions. It's going to be quite difficult to say, is that 6 millimeters, 7 millimeters? With CTC, we're very precise and actually quite accurate. With colonoscopy, that data was pretty fuzzy, so just keep that in mind. We can go one step further, and we have automated segmentation to actually measure volumes of polyps. And this is where it really comes into play for follow-up. It's all about volume. The linear size is a very poor predictor of change because the volume is clearly amplified. You think about a hemisphere that's 4 millimeters in let's say radius and increases to 5 millimeters. That actually is doubled in volume, as we know from the equation for the volume of a sphere. So it amplifies these linear measurements very nicely. And I'll be showing many examples of these volumetric measurements, because going forward, when we have polyps in vivo, this is the way to really tell if a lesion is significantly increasing or not. The linear measurements will often let you down. In terms of size, it's no doubt that it clearly drives histology. We've never seen a true subcentimeter cancer. I'll show more evidence that they're exceedingly rare. Only a few papers have had some anecdotal cases. Even at 1 to 2 centimeters, notice how only 1% of large 1 to 2 centimeter polyps actually are malignant polyps. So that's actually quite rare. It's not until you get to the masses at 3 centimeters that cancer or high-grade dysplasia come into play. High-grade dysplasia is actually quite rare as well. So it's really just tubulovillous histology that drives the advanced definition with these smaller lesions. And we compared this to the literature and actually matched quite well with pooled results. Showing in 6 to 9 millimeter lesions, about 4 or 5% generally have the tubulovillous component. This was all reinforced by a recent study by Doug Rex, who's sort of the king of colonoscopy. Over 40,000 polyps they analyzed. And again, this is colonoscopy data, so the measurements may not be perfect, but I think they can tell sub-centimeter. They actually had no malignant lesions out of 40,000 sub-centimeter polyps. And if you look at it, high-grade dysplasia and villus are very rare, less than 1%, even in the small lesions up to a centimeter. Tubulovillous, again, about 5%, so that's driving that definition. And then of the serrated lesions, it was unclear, but I don't think any of them had dysplasia, so none of them would have been advanced. They're actually very benign lesions under a centimeter. So just getting back to diminutive lesions and how we should handle them, we've now done a couple of thousand patients at screening where they've had a negative CTC, come back 5 or even 10 years later. Some people don't show up on the 5th anniversary, of course. And the good news is none of these diminutive lesions ever exploded into cancer, or it's very rare. So every now and then a diminutive lesion is shown here, comes back for follow-up and is non-diminutive, so some turn positive, but very few really become advanced lesions in that time frame. So it's safe to follow these diminutive lesions. We've written a lot on cost effectiveness. I don't want to really dwell on this, but theoretically in this one study, basically when we looked at if we sent every diminutive lesion we were able to identify at CTC, we'd have to remove thousands of polyps to prevent a single cancer over 10 years at about $500,000 US dollars per life year gained. And obviously that's ludicrous. If you focus on large lesions, however, if you remove 10 of them, you've probably prevented a cancer. That's probably an underestimation, but it's at a cost savings because the downstream costs of cancer care are avoided by preventing a cancer, much better than detecting an early malignancy, of course. Now, here's another reason to avoid diminutive lesions. This is a 51-year-old at our institution, had a screening colonoscopy. It was a normal study except for this tiny little lesion, which turned out to be a mucosal tag, basically, normal mucosa, about 2 or 3 millimeters. So at CTC, this presumably would have been a negative exam and nothing further would have been done. This patient actually came back several days later, had as you can see, a ruptured spleen and massive hemoperitoneum, which is a fairly now well-recognized a delayed complication of colonoscopy. We wrote a case series of these a number of years ago, so something to be aware of. Not as common as perforation or bleeding or infection and other things, but still quite something you will see in your practice. But this just points out the fact that maybe we shouldn't be so aggressive for diminutive lesions. Maybe we should only send those patients that really need a therapeutic colonoscopy to that invasive procedure. Okay, let's talk about polyp morphology. And this Of course, pedunculated lesions, we know they're more, that they're not as prevalent as sessile lesions. We know that they are typically large and advanced, and I could show you all the numbers for that. I will show you later that they're more aggressive, and they are highly conspicuous, so there's really no issue with detecting these lesions. In terms of flat lesions, these are less often advanced, as I'll show you. They're obviously actually quite rare to be truly flat or depressed. And it's a greatly misunderstood group of lesions, actually. It's partly because many of the interval cancers are probably missed flat lesions. But having said that, I'll show you evidence that these lesions are actually very innocuous and very slow growing, so time is on our side. The other issue is sensitivity and specificity are decreased. Our positive predictive value for these are decreased. Some of those may truly be optical colonoscopy false negatives, but nonetheless, some of them are false positives. This study kind of got everyone riled up. You know, it looks from the title, flat and depressed lesions, oh no. But if you read it very carefully, it actually, they go on to say flat and depressed lesions are extremely rare, and they didn't have any in this series. So they didn't have any of these lesions. They were all raised, and if they had a depression, they had a raised edge. So these are all detectable by CTC with good techniques. So that was kind of, that got everyone a little bent out of shape. We've known about flat lesions. We've been able to detect them back to the DoD trial. In our experience, our University of Wisconsin experience shows that they are much less likely to be either histologically advanced or malignant, even up to 3 centimeters. They're almost never malignant. And then if you look at carpet lesions, these are now over 3 centimeters, on average about 4 to 5 centimeters in this series. These also, the majority are benign. So this is an 8 centimeter villus adenoma in the rectum. All of these, we had 18 cases in this series. All of them showed contrast coating, so it's a very easy way to detect, and that corresponds again to that mucus cap seen at optical colonoscopy. So these tend to be in the rectum and the cecum. A few of them were serrated, but most of these are tubulovillous and villus lesions. Here's one in the cecum. You can see this, the red signifies a soft tissue component of this subtle flat lesion, which is sitting across from the ileocecal valve here. And then, again, that contrast coating is showing up on the soft tissue windows very nicely, and that's how we detect some of these lesions. Fairly bland looking at colonoscopy, so these are difficult to detect even at colonoscopy, but we tend to find most carpet lesions. And again, positive predictive value, we do over 90% for all lesions 6 millimeters and greater, except for those that are flat. At this point, we fell under 80%. Again, some of those are their misses, false negatives, but some of them are our overcalls. So here's just an example of a screening study, and then we're going to get into the more interesting data on surveillance. This is a patient that actually had, I don't know how well it shows, there's a subtle flat lesion in the cecum here. There's a subtle sessile lesion. This was at initial screening. The patient had actually had a perforation at colonoscopy years earlier, so chose CTC for future follow-up. This actually, we're seeing the flat lesion and the sessile lesion here. This was sub-centimeter. This was about 2 centimeters. So this patient was actually followed in 2 years, did not want to undergo colonoscopy. And that sessile lesion actually just exploded. This is one of the fastest growing sessile lesions we've ever seen. Whereas the flat lesion kind of stayed the same. It didn't really increase. And that's typical of what we see between flat and sessile lesions as well as pedunculated lesions. Here's a fly-through just to show you. So now we're looking at the appendiceal orifice there. There's the ileocecal valve. And then there's the flat and the sessile lesion. That flat lesion is much larger in a linear sense, but has less volume, so is less conspicuous, of course. But that sessile lesion is actually quite easy to see. So that lesion, they were both sent to colonoscopy. Here's the colonoscopy of the flat lesion, subtle for them as well. The polypoid lesion was quite obvious, of course. There was a little bit of bleeding. They were able to control it. And sorry, both of these lesions were tubulovillous. But the volume increase of that sessile lesion was tenfold, whereas the flat lesion didn't even double in volume. And that's what we persistently see. And that's why we're going to talk now about the longitudinal follow-up. These are, CTC is really an ideal tool for this because we can follow these lesions. We have essentially perfect localization between 2 studies in terms of our colon map. And then we also have the ability to do volumetric. I won't get into other potential dynamic predictors and focus on CTC surveillance. Now, there have been other studies that have been done years ago, before I was born. A couple of, there was a BE study In '63, there was a Flex-Sig study that same year. There was a study in Scandinavia on colonoscopy. All of these followed these small lesions, and you can imagine that that's not easy to do. They all demonstrated a very benign indolent course. Even large polyps in this famous Stryker study at BE, large polyps at 10-year follow-up only had a less than 10% chance of malignancy. So time is on our side. These things aren't taking off, before our eyes. All of these studies, however, have major limitations, as you can imagine. This is just an image from the BE study from 1963. They followed this small lesion. I'm not sure I can even see it here, but you can imagine the localization and measurement and confidence of detection is going to, in expert hands, probably okay, but nowhere near CTC. And you can imagine endoscopy is even harder. If you're not in the rectum or seeing the ileocecal valve, you really have no idea where you are with, although it's an educated guess. So that brings us to our CTC polyp natural history trial. This was done with the UW and the Navy component, the two programs we had started. We had followed about 300 lesions, 6 to 9 millimeters, about 2 years. You'll see now we have much more follow-up, but this published study set the tone. We had histo proof in about a third of the lesions. And what do we see? I'm not going to go into detail on this slide, but only to show, and I'll show it graphically later, that volumetric assessment separated out lesions much better than linear. With linear, everything's clustered into no change because that change of a millimeter or less can be very difficult. Whereas if you look at volumetric measurement, and this is using a 20% increase or decrease in volume, you can see about 20% of lesions progressed, about half were stable, and about 30 regressed, and 10% of those actually resolved. So I think this is the first evidence that there's true resolution of these polyps beyond a doubt. And then again, advanced adenomas almost all grew, and non-advanced adenomas tended to grow much more than what we called non-neoplastic. Now the serrated lesions, which we didn't know about, were actually lumped into that group, so I'll show you those separately going forward. And if we look at volume change per year, the advanced adenomas, again, are growing very fast. Non-advanced adenomas have positive growth, and some of these at that time actually had a net negative growth. If you look at linear size, though, it's pretty difficult to say, oh, is that getting bigger by a millimeter a year? You don't want to question growth, and 77% average growth per year is quite obvious visually. And getting back to morphology, so as I mentioned, pedunculated lesions actually did grow more often progressed than sessile, and flat lesions rarely progressed within that 2-year interval, which is again fairly short. The location of greatest progression was seen in the cecum and rectum, interestingly, and then in the transverse and ascending were the least likely to progress, and that kind of gets back to the flat lesions, which again don't tend to progress very fast, if at all. None of these cases progressed to cancer, so we're comfortable now going from 1 to 2 year follow-up out to 3-year, which is our current standard of care. We do 3-year follow-up. There was a Dutch trial of less than 100 polyps, but nonetheless showed basically the same sort of findings that we were able to show in that natural history trial. So just a few quick examples. I want to get to the more interesting stuff. This polyp in a year grew less than a millimeter, but increased by 50% by volume, and it's pretty visually obvious. That was a tubulovillous adenoma. This polyp did have over a millimeter of growth at 1 year, but grew 153% by volume. So again, visually it's so obvious. The visual matches the volumetric. Basically, we can look at something and see if there's more or less volume, but the linear measurements are very disappointing in this regard. So now, here we get to the meat of it. This is what we're doing. We now have cumulative data on over 600 polyps in 450 patients. Many of these have actually had more than 2 CT time points. So 140 patients, we have multiple time points because we've had stable polyps that haven't gone on. And also you can see our average follow-up interval is now over 7.5 years. So this is much more robust data. We have over 350 histologically proven lesions. So this is a TVA on the bottom there. So here's an example I just want to show, just to kind of speak for all other cases. This was a study just from last year. There are 2 lesions you can see in the red dots in the rectum and actually the transverse colon. If we focus on that transverse colon lesion, this is a 6 millimeter lesion, just over what we would even call, but really plump looking 6 millimeter lesion, and that turned out to be a tubular adenoma. In the rectum, there's an even larger lesion sitting next to the rectal catheter. that measured, I'll get to the measurements later, that was resected. This is a tubulovillus adenoma. So this is where the data used to be with colonoscopy or even CTC. You remove a lesion and then you figure out post-polypectomy risk. Well, with these cases now, let me show you what really happened in this case. This patient started in 2007 and actually underwent 4 scans over time, over a decade now. And you can see this lesion went from diminutive, finally turned non-diminutive on the last study, but the volume actually quadrupled here from 21 to 120, and visually you can see that increase, but the linear size just doesn't show that very nicely. Now the rectal lesion is a little more difficult. This was, you can see there's a sessile lesion, it's diminutive, that's actually on the area of prostatic impression. It was missed initially. It was found on a subsequent study, but thought to maybe be growing. It was just too big to be believed. So they actually recommended digital rectal exam to see if that was just stool. It's very homogeneous, so I don't think stool really looks like that ever and remains adherent. But this thing actually went 5 years later, and you can see even though it grew 4 millimeters from 2012 to 2017, its volume went 2.5-fold and actually 10-fold from 2007. So this thing really took off. But even so, that's still a benign lesion. Even though we missed it, kind of dropped the ball on it, time is on our side. That is going to become a cancer, I would say, but it may be another 5 to 10 years. So we halt it in its tracks at this point. So here's the cumulative. This is unpublished data. We only have a few cancers, but you can see the cancers obviously grow at a very quick rate. This is against final histology. Tubulovillus, look at how fast they grow. I'm now a believer that tubulovillus lesions are important. It's not just high-grade dysplasia. And then tubular, you can see grow, whereas serrated, hyperplastic, and unresected lesions have very little or no growth. And just one more example. This is another missed lesion. I'm showing all our warts here. 2007, this was a negative study. Maybe there's nothing next to the ileocecal valve. Now in 2012, there was a missed lesion next to the valve. You can see it's now segmented, so it's clearly seen. Went for another follow-up 5 years later. That thing had grown considerably, and now was 2 centimeters when it was missed, believe it or not. That's a pretty significant miss. Now is measuring over 3 centimeters, so it qualifies as a mass. Again, about half of our masses are benign. This is a tubulovillus adenoma, so we haven't missed anything. The opportunity for prevention is still here. It just shows how easy this is. We can wait until things become quite advanced before we even have to worry about them. Okay, so multiple time points. I'm going to go through this really quickly, but remember we had 140 patients with multiple CT time points. These were 2 cancers that were growing very rapidly. But let's move on, and we'll just increase the scale and show all the others. Those in red were resected. Those in blue were unresected. So the blue ones tended to be stable, of course, or not. There's no reason to send those. Whereas the red ones tend to be spiking up at their last follow-up, and then we send a colonoscopy, of course. And then if you look at those resected lesions, most of them are adenomas, whereas the serrated lesions tend to be very slowly growing, if at all. And that gets to this serrated, I just finished a manuscript on this trip here that we're going to be submitting, and this is one of the figures, basically showing that these sessile serrated lesions grow even slower than non-advanced small tubular adenomas. So I don't think we need to worry about these. We want to detect them when they're large. I don't lose any sleep about missing these when they're sub-centimeter. Here's an example, and again, most of these cases were missed at initial screening. Subtle lesion, only in retrospect, when we find it again, now that we know about this contrast coding and so forth, we go back to the old study, and sure enough, there it is, and it hasn't really grown, and it's this bland lesion, and it's a sessile serrated lesion without dysplasia. Here's another example, 8 years apart. And again, very little growth, seen better now because of the contrast cap, very bland lesion. These things are not exploding. We've followed 60 of them over about 5 years time. Not a single one of them even had dysplasia at the time of resection. And then finally, too, I mentioned about this issue of polyp resolution. This is sort of one of these smoking gun cases where you can see a lesion 2 years later was still there in the descending colon, no doubt. That's a real polyp by all standards. 4 years later, it had resolved. So polyps do resolve, and again, about 10% will. Okay, I want to finish up real quickly with interval cancers. These are typically defined as cancers that are preceded by a negative colonoscopy, usually within 3 years. So I'll use that term loosely because any prior colonoscopy may be longer than 3 years, but we tend to use 3 years as the benchmark. Possible explanations would include that these could be rapidly growing, maybe incompletely resected, which of course they would know about, or missed lesions. And I think it's pretty widely appreciated or agreed upon that the vast majority of these are missed lesions. I'll show some evidence from CTC that that's probably the case for us as well. And we all know that colonoscopy has long had this poor protection of right-sided cancers. That's probably from serrated lesions getting missed, but of course, now these are slow growing, so they'd have to be missed for decades, but serrated cancers tend to be in a much older population, so they were probably missed maybe many times. And up to 10% of all cancers that are seen at colonoscopy are preceded by a negative colonoscopy within 3 years, so they qualify as interval cancers. So this is a real issue, and just remember this number, about 0.8 to 3 cases per 1,000 patient years. We'll compare that to CTC. So again, we've known about, from CTC, we can show why things might get missed. This is a right-sided malignant polyp, the smallest cancer I've ever seen. It was part of our original DoD trials, about 12 millimeters, I think, but still not sub-centimeter. The scope kept slipping, but we had a high confidence lesion, so they finally were able to press in the right place and find this cancer, and that's how they had 50% sensitivity in that DoD trial, because they missed one of the 2 cancers prospectively. Now, we went on to show why do lesions get missed. We looked at all our discordant lesions. In a trial, you have to assume they're all false positives by us, right? But in clinical practice, we can follow these up and show that many of them, almost half of them, are false negatives on their part. So here's a good example. This is an elderly patient screening. We see this definite lesion in the cecum. You can see here it's coated with contrast, elongated lesion. That went to colonoscopy same day. They showed all these views. They labeled it. They said they used the ileocecal valve, retroflex. It didn't exist, so that's our false positive. But we review all these cases and say, no, we think this is their miss. So the patient came back within a year, had a follow-up CTC, and sure enough, that lesion was there again. It had gotten a couple millimeters bigger in about 9 months. But we know this is real. We sent it to the head of endoscopy, who easily was able to find this behind the ileocecal valve fold. But we warned them in advance. This is a difficult lesion. Warning, it's behind a fold. And then here's an example of how we can track at CTC. We actually can paint what we've seen. And as we fly, as a colonoscope would, you can see when you turn around and look back, these unpainted areas are the blind spots. So this just goes to show that lesion was missed because it was clearly in a blind spot. So it's very gratifying, and it makes colonoscopy better, I think, but these are very complementary tests. CTC is obviously not perfect. I've shown you misses of our own. And then there was a nice paper out of the UK, my friends and colleagues, Andrew Plum and David Burling and others, Steve Halligan, they came up with this nice meta-analysis looking at interval cancers at CTC now. And notice the rate is actually less, so we seem to be better at not missing cancers, or at least not missing lesions that go on to cancer in 3 years than colonoscopy. And interestingly, of those missed lesions, all but 2 we could go back and find the lesions. So I think the same would be said of colonoscopy. They have the benefit, I would say, of not being able to review their studies. We have the curse of having these studies in our PAC system. Any miss we can go back and find. It doesn't mean we're worse than they are. It just means they can prove that it was a miss, whereas a colonoscopy, it's like, wow, that was a fast-growing lesion. You know, like it's really not a fair game, but that's the reality of it. So just, I'm going to flip through some interval cancers that we've seen. This is the fastest growing one. So this was a 6 millimeter lesion. It was due for their 3-year follow-up. Also had a PET study because they had a head and neck cancer. And it's interesting that polyp actually is hypermetabolic, and you'll see why here. In 2016, this thing has exploded from this little 6 millimeter thing all the way to nearly 2 centimeters in size, and has gone over 10 times in volume. So this is the most rapidly growing lesion I've ever seen, and it actually proved to be one of our few malignant polyps. And again, this is a curable cancer, so nothing lost. Interestingly, we've shown that head and neck cancer patients actually have a higher risk of colorectal lesions, but that's an aside. This was a malignant polyp. This case was probably the one case I think we missed a serrated lesion, and it did go on to cancer. I don't know how well it projects, but there's a flat coated lesion. It looks like every single serrated lesion we'll ever see. It was missed. It wasn't appreciated back then that these lesions existed. Went on 5 years later to become a small cancer, again, curable. The patient's doing well, cancer-free. This is the only case I'm aware of where we haven't been able to find a precursor. So you can see here in 2005, we're looking at the exact same area. There's a cancer 10 years later that I just can't see any precursor lesion. So take that for what it's worth. So I'm going to just flip through the future in a few slides and then we'll be done. But we've looked at a number of things. I would urge you to, if you're interested, you can read this review looking at tumorigenesis. We have an NIH R01 trial looking at radiogenomics. So now we have all these resected polyps. We know what their fate was before resection. So we're going to look at their genetic and epigenetic profiles and try to show what we think we're seeing is, in this early pilot study, that a lot of these polyps have early mutations. It's not a linear thing. They're actually born to be bad. They have mutations at the beginning of their genesis, if you will. I won't go into proteomics, but we've looked at pre and post polypectomy, and there are proteins in the blood that either upgrade or downgrade, and maybe this is the future. Who doesn't want a blood test that can tell you you have important advanced neoplasia, as shown in the dark gray here? So CRP seems to go up a lot after an advanced neoplasm is resected. We're not sure why. And then finally, tumorigenesis. This is really interesting. So I've already alluded to the fact that it's not this really linear stepwise thing. It's more this subclonal population of multiple early mutations, some of which take off, some of which don't. Maybe there are additional mutations. The evolutionary tempo shown on the bottom here is probably more of a punctuated equilibrium. They're born with lots of mutations. They may have a stasis period, maybe some gradualism, maybe more punctuation, but it's not as easy as just the linear adenoma-carcinoma sequence. So, with that bit of whirlwind, sorry I went a little quickly through a lot of that to finish on time, but I tried to show you that these sub-centimeter lesions are not the enemy. They're essentially ubiquitous. They're like the mole on my neck. You wouldn't remove it. Why should you remove a sub-centimeter lesion? Doesn't make any sense to me. But you probably all agree with that because you're not using colonoscopy screening by and large. The window is very, very wide open for this prevention. As I tried to show you, even missed lesions, time is on our side. CTC really focuses on that Goldilocks zone, as I tried to show you, and therefore is a very highly attractive test for screening, in my opinion. The stool-based tests, they lack the prevention, and colonoscopy is too aggressive, but should be the therapeutic gold standard, which is what obviously all roads lead to colonoscopy if you have the significant lesion. Now, don't misunderstand me like Prince William here. I'm not trying to say these are bad tests. I just think CTC is thrice as good, if you will. I don't know if any of you have seen this image, but it's all a matter of perspective, right? He's not really doing what you think he might be doing. So with that, though, CTC has provided basically the raw material for this natural history as a byproduct of our screening, and that's what I've tried to present today. So with that, I thank you for your attention.
It gives me great pleasure to present you with this award in recognition of our appreciation that you've traveled so far to share your vast and detailed knowledge and experience in this crucial subject. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.